like, now I feel bad because if I want a new cell phone, I'm gonna have to finish my new album and try to get it out before Halloween the way I think. You know what I'm saying?
It's always good to have priorities in life, such as listening to episode 343 of Radio Free Innsmouth, which is going to be about one of the most misunderstood and in some ways underrated bands of all time, that being Septic Flesh.
아, 이거는 못 고르지.
That's right, that weird band with the costume guys and all the keyboards that you had to sit through between Inquisition and Deicide.
You are all weirdos.
See, that's kind of the issue with these dudes, is a lot of people that probably actually would be really into Septic Flesh aren't huge on them because they only know them in their modern incarnation. I can think of at least 5 separate occasions in real life and on the internet where I brought Septic Flesh up and people were just like, what? Those guys? And then they actually listened to the right albums and they're like, oh wow, these guys actually kick ass. In order to fix that, we're going to have to ask the question, just what the heck am I talking about when I say Septic Flesh?
What is
Septic Flesh?
a miserable little pile of
Symphonic metal.
Now, if you can read, which I realize is a big ask, you may have noticed that I spelled Septic Flesh as 2 words in the title of this episode. And nowadays, Septic Flesh goes by a 1-word band name, Septic Flesh, like all crammed together. I'm talking about Septic Flesh, not Septic Flesh. And you'd think that would be the easy demarcation line because they switched to the 1-word name on their 2008 kind of comeback / mainstream breakthrough album, which they consider to be a new era for the band. And yeah, that kind of is the start of the modern Septic Flesh sound. But for me, old school 2-word Septic Flesh is actually even older than that. You see, the last album they put out before they started using the 1-word variation of their name, that being 2003's Sumerian Demons, doesn't really have that much in common with the classical Septic Flesh of the 90s apart from some aesthetic concerns. It really does just sound like the kind of stuff they would do on albums like Communion and The Great Mass, but with beefier guitars and without an orchestra. And the album before Sumerian Demons, 1999's Revolution DNA, doesn't really sound like any other Septic Flesh album at all. It's very much a kind of weird gothic, industrial, sort of avant-garde metal album that incorporates a lot of modern for the time melodic death metal elements. Upon revisiting it last week, it was actually a lot better than I remembered it being, but at the same time, it really doesn't sound like Septic Flesh, as in the classic Septic Flesh. For me, classic Septic Flesh starts with their demo and their EP, goes up through those first 3 albums, and then ends with 1998's A Fallen Temple, which is listed as a full-length album, but is really more like a weird compilation, split into 3 parts. The first part being 3 new songs in the style of the prior album, The Ophidian Wheel, and then there's a re-recording of their debut EP from 1991, and then there's just kind of a whole bunch of wacky, goofy nonsense that sounds like Mortis trying to cover Diamanda Galas. But nowhere near as interesting or frightening as that description might lead you to believe. Final third of Fallen Temple don't really care about, but those first 2/3 are a really good way to cap off the 2-word Septic Flesh band legacy. Because the first part is the last material they ever recorded in that style, and then the second part is them revisiting their older material from that style. And that first third actually acts as a pretty good introduction to what Septic Flesh is about. Because when you hear this, if you've only ever heard newer Septic Flesh, this is probably going to blow your mind. Because a lot of this portion of the album features some downright crunchy, groovy sounding death metal, with Spiros' vocals absolutely savaging your eardrums over all of it, one of the lowest and nastiest sounding growls in the business. But then early Septic Flesh's secret weapon kicks in, that being Christos and Soteris' twin guitar attack. Some of the most well-done Hellenic melodic black metal type stuff, equal to, if not better, than the classics from Rotting Christ. It's an aspect of their sound that's pretty much been replaced by orchestration and much more stereotypical, heavy sounding guitar work on their modern releases. And then they hit you with this wacky shit. Probably the best utilization of clean vocals in an extreme metal band. And they weave in so well with that melodic Hellenic black metal style harmonized guitar work. The whole thing is about weaving all 3 of these elements together. Real chunky death metal, amazing melodic lead guitar work, and then the combination of super brutal death growling vocals and clean vocals that are way better than they have any right to be. That's what old school Septic Flesh was all about. If you've been listening to or watching the program for a while, you might remember episode 320 about Holy Records, Records, which brought you On Thorns I Lay, Yearning, and Tristitia. Well, Septic Flesh were signed to Holy Records back during their heyday, and they pretty much invented that particular style of metal that label became famous for, along with fellow Greeks Nightfall, who I covered on episode 160. Although, as much as I love Nightfall, I gotta say, Septic Flesh do the style even better. They do the style better than just about anyone, and they've been at it since their 1991 Temple of the Lost Race EP, pretty much. I mean, that EP tends to lean a little bit more into straight-up death metal, which is to be expected given the time period. But even that death metal is still a lot weirder in its utilization of melody and layered guitar parts than was typical for any other band of the time period. Like right here, yeah, this is a normal sort of chugging riff, but it has that kind of Hellenic black metal melodic sense to it, sort of creeping around in the soul of its melodies, as well as when they bust out the tremolo pick riffs like this. Somewhat comparable to the kind of stuff that At the Gates and Unanimated would be doing a year or two later. Then we get back into the brutal chugging stuff, but again, we get into even more of that layered, spooky melodic shit, and as the drums slow down, they begin to move into that uniquely Greek style of atmospheric metal that was endemic pretty much to Greece alone at the time of recording. Like right here, this combination of keyboard and melodic bass guitar playing, then subtly bringing in a very constant sort of lead guitar line, before then going into even spookier territory with the keyboards. This is the kind of thing that only really Septic Flesh and their compatriots Nightfall and Horrified were doing this early in the 90s. As mentioned earlier, I think Septic Flesh probably does it the best out of any band dabbling in this style at the time. And that's just on this EP, which is definitely their most normal sounding release compared to where they would go with their full lengths going forward.
You are all weirdos.
The first of which being Mystic Places of Dawn, which I gotta think, if you heard this back in 1994, it probably blew your fucking mind. Album starts out with a very heroic, almost US power metal a la Manila Road sounding, consonant and melodic, super catchy riff with a lot of moving parts to it. From there, they repeat the riff, but add some very fleet-fingered, cyclical lead guitar work over it. If you can't tell by now, lead guitar in this era of Septic Flesh is always going to be a major strong suit, in addition to their penchant for epic narrative. And then they hit you with a disconcerting contrast between very nasty sounding vocals and this echoey, reverbed out, very clean sounding guitar. I gotta think Paradise Lost's Gothic album from a couple years prior was a big influence on this aspect of the band. And that's a great album to be influenced by. But as much as I love Paradise Lost Gothic, Septic Flesh does so much more with that sound, as you're about to hear right now when they take a turn for the eldritch and ancient sounding. A lot of this music just sounds old, like ancient, in a good way. I think that might be part of the reason why I often compare them to Manila Road during this time period. And speaking of Manila Road, they also have some very heroic sounding solo. Again, almost kind of a melancholic power metal feeling to a lot of the melodies they're spitting out, but still in a very dark, extreme metal sort of way. Classic Greek black metal and Greek death metal was very good at that sort of thing. And as previously mentioned, Septic Flesh were one of the best, if not the best, to ever take on that style. You've got songs like Chasing the Chimera, which again has a very ancient feeling, particularly in the twin guitars, which start out with this cyclical, repetitive melody that ends up becoming something of a motivic skeleton for the song to hang its riffs upon. Like right here, where the first more death metal-y part very organically emerges out of the pulsating murk of that intro bit with this sort of slow, deathly waltz of unfurling melodies. From there, they hit you with a nice sort of counterpoint riff that adds an extra layer of harmony to everything. And the melodies themselves are very long form, despite their more simplistic origins at the beginning of the song. They seem endless in a way, just continuously unfolding until the first major riff shift. this particular melody going on right now, probably my favorite on the album. Very redolent of the kind of stuff that Catatonia would do in their early years. And appropriately enough, we go into more of a doom metal sounding section with its creeping sense of dread and melancholy increasing as it continues to unfold. And then you realize it's all still a variation of that opening riff. Everything emerges from that point of genesis organically, made even more obvious right here when they're literally just playing a more aggressive and angry sounding variant on that pulsating opening riff, which then by a very halting and tragic sort of transition leads again into the as always excellent lead guitar solo playing. This is where we run into something I like to call the Septic Flesh syndrome, which specifically applies to me having to edit this episode. This album has so many good songs on it with so many cool parts, but to demonstrate why all those cool parts work so well would take so many just like long form samples that at some point I just end up playing the entire song. And we still got a couple more albums to get through, so we can't really be dealing with that right now. Basically, go buy Mystic Places at Dawn. It's fucking awesome. Even if the reissue cover is one of the ugliest piles of piss I've ever seen.
Well, that just happened.
Septic Flesh's sophomore effort, Esoptron, might be even better than Mystic Places of Dawn. This album seems them broadening their already very wide variety of sounds even further, and it's got even more of a mysterious, ancient feel to everything. A lot of that probably has to do with the foggier guitar sound they're utilizing this time around, but just as much of that comes from the melodies behind the riffs themselves, which are a little bit less power metal-y this time around, as well as being a little bit less Paradise Lost sounding. In place of that, we have an almost Atlantean sounding ancient feeling, which is further bolstered by the much more notable utilization of clean guitar lines this time around, as well as a much more prominent usage of keyboards, which had already been a factor in their sound for years at this point. It's just taken to the next level here. But more than that, you have these really furtive melodic lines like the one you're hearing right now. They kind of wrap around the core of the music, and they don't really have a clear starting or ending point the way a lot of more normal metal riffs do. Or at least that's the case until we get to parts where they more notably take over the music, at which point they start operating under more determinedly phrasal rules with these very stately sort of melodies like the one you're hearing right now. And then we're into a more uplifting and hopeful version of that clean guitar part from the beginning of the song. But just in case you were worried, these guys were getting a little too proggy and wimpy to hit you with this little bit of nastiness. Real authentic blasting death metal, but with an eerie floating melody over top of all of it, kind of droning away in an atmospheric manner, which takes us into some groovy, chunky death metal, which is another thing this band was always good at. And from there we're back to the atmospheric stuff again, with a reiteration of that Asiatic sounding melody from early in the song, leading us into more of those floating, harmonized guitars, Paradise Lost, circa Gothic, on secret drugs only obtainable from canopic jars next to mummies in Atlantis. My personal favorite song on this album, Ice Castle, goes even crazier with the clean guitar parts, which pretty much dominate the first 2/3 of this song, providing the backbone for that winding lead guitar to spin its tales of antediluvian woe. As the vocals drop in, the lead guitar recedes, before then reasserting itself with another very interesting sort of flowing melody that takes us into my favorite clean guitar riff of the album, that being this little jangly bit right here. I don't know, man, it's real simple, but for some reason, that part has always stuck with me. Spends a lot of time repeating itself in my head over the course of any given workday. I spent a lot of time listening to this song in particular on the train when I was going to college. From there, we're into keyboards and just doom and gloom. Very cinematic in style, with a descending apocalyptic melody, which is further bolstered by the reintroduction of heavy distorted guitars. And eventually the vocals come back and it's fucking nasty sounding in a good way. This album's amazing. Much like Mystic Places of Dawn, it's just full of great songs, and it's got that Septic Flesh syndrome thing going on again, where it would take way too long for me to go through every part of this album that's sick as fuck. So again, I'm just gonna have to tell you, go fucking buy this. It's easy to get because it's been reissued. Again, unfortunately, with a really fucking ugly digital album art cover.
Well, that just happened.
You know, it is what it is. I remember back in the day before this stuff got reissued, you'd be dropping $200 to get an original CD of this on Discogs. And now we get to my personal favorite Septic Flesh album and the one that got me into them back in the day. That being their third release, 1997's The Ophidian Wheel. This one had a pretty major budget upgrade in the production department, or at least it sure sounds like it. The guitar sound is a lot more polished sounding this time around, and even the drum machine sounds a lot realer, which is very helpful because the death metal portions of this release are by far the heaviest they had done in that arena to date. I mean, check out this sick fucking groove riff right here. Simple but monolithic in scope. But fret not, ye lovers of the atmospheric, because that shit's all over this release too. The keyboards are at their most symphonic sounding that they'd ever been, tying in really nicely with those lead guitars, and also taking over the music at certain points, like right here, in this transition section that leads us into the real attention grabber of this release. That being guest soprano Natalia Rasuli, who does an amazing job elevating the material on this release. But it's not just all about the clean vocals, as you're hearing in this great little bit of melodic guitar playing right here, as well as during this more ambient, kind of semi-thrashy, groovy follow-up riff that sounds like it could have come off a Therian album, a really good Therian album. This release is just chock full of super memorable moments. Other bands might have more technical riffing styles or more riffs per song, but not too many bands could stand toe-to-toe with this era of Septic Flesh in terms of just quality of memorable songwriting. Like Septic Flesh syndrome, as I've termed it, where there's just too many fucking cool parts to talk about, is at an all-time high on this release. Like the title track, that's got a sick fucking melody, what goes like... But they use that as a springboard to do all sorts of crazy shit. They got this song on here called Phallic Litanies. Starts out with near a minute of instrumental dungeon synth-esque majesty in the vein of the best of summoning. Then the vocals get introduced and... It's this perfect back and forth between harsh growling vocals and mixed male and female clean vocals. Then you get to the real esoteric meat of the song with this odd stop-start orchestral riff. Which proceeds to get gradually weirder and weirder as the song goes on. And just when it feels like it's all going to collapse into chaos, the vocals are back there to reassure you. In an act of catharsis worthy of the greatest of Greek tragedies. And somewhere in the midst of all this high drama, they managed to drop this fucking monster of a melody on you. The whole album is just chock full of crazy songwriting like that. And again, because it's this era of Septic Flesh, it's not all just progressive, melodic, whatever the fuck. They get brutal too. You got the song on here, Razor Blades of Guilt. Starts out with almost Swedish death metal sounding, brutal D-beat oriented riffs, before then launching into some signature Septic Flesh groove death riffs, made all the heavier by the stellar production job. Then the melodic guitars kind of worm their way back in, but the melodies have taken on this almost frantic sort of cast in the context of the death metal appearance that they're making here. It's all just vintage, progressive Greek melodic death metal, and it subtly shifts gears into the atmospheric effortlessly, with sections like this very much picking up on the style of Esoptron, before that melodic waterfall just comes crashing back down with those unmistakable Septic Flesh style harmonies. This melodic section right here is another one that's almost constantly playing itself in the background of my mind, and it goes into another great doomy Paradise Lost, but honestly better than Paradise Lost style riff, which is these overlapping waves of melodic sound. Ophidian Wheel, you can't go wrong with it. And I'm not even going to do the Cobra Puke joke concerning the reissue album art on this one, because I actually managed to get a hold of the original Holy Records pressing of this, so I can gaze lovingly at the OG cover art on my shelf. Septic Flesh, as in 2 words, Septic Flesh. Some of the best stuff ever, and if you're into the Greek melodic shit and you haven't listened to these guys, you're really fucking missing out. So go and give that shit a listen. Thanks for listening and watching whatever you did, and see you next time.
Say goodnight, folks.
Good night, folks.